So, in this module we will actually be talking about a cryptographic technique called as a digital signature. So, what exactly is a digital signature? So, it is a cryptographic technique that is very similar to our normal handwritten signatures, right. So, when we actually try to attest a piece of a document, a hard copy document with our own signature, what essentially we are trying to convey here is that we are basically accepting the contents of whatever has been written down or printed out in that piece of paper till the line that we are in which we are actually putting our physical signature, right. So, essentially the whole reason for this, as we are very well understand, is tomorrow we should not be in a position to basically sort of deny that we have never accepted the contents of whatever we are signing right now with, right. So, similarly, if I have a requirement that I should basically sign a document in a digital form, in a soft copy form, then the digital signature that we are going to be talking about here is the very common technique that is typically used to sort of establish that this particular person has actually accepted the contents of the document that he is right now digitally signing with. So, he could actually be the document owner, or he could be just a person who has modified the contents of the document or whatever it is, but essentially by affixing the digital signature, the person is sort of accepting that he is agreeing to whatever are the contents of that particular soft copy or the digital document, right. So, this digital signature is expected to be verifiable and also non-forgeable. Now, what we mean by verifiable is that if at all there is a contention that it has to be taken to a third party for sort of verifying that it was indeed this person who has actually affixed his digital signature, then that is something that should be possible, number one. Number two, when we talk about non-forgeable, as we would very clearly understand, forgeability is basically a mechanism by which somebody tries to put our signature or sort of forges our signature in such a way that without our real acceptance we are bound by whatever has been actually stated in that particular document, right. Now, with this digital signature mechanism, it also should be possible that nobody should be capable of forging our signature out and then sort of then making it as a part of our acceptance to the contents of whatever has been forged and signed with our digital signature. So, these two are the primary requirements for the digital signature. One, it should be verifiable, and then two, it should be non-forgeable by any kind of a unauthorized person, right. So, in this case the recipient should be able to prove to someone that the original sender has been the one who has actually been signed the document digitally, and on his behalf or without his consent or awareness nobody else had actually signed it, right. So, with these important characteristics we will see how the digital signature is actually created and how does it actually work. So, how does this digital signature really work? So, when Bob wants to send a message M to a recipient, what Bob actually tries to do is he basically signs the message M by encrypting with his own private key. So, as we had seen in the previous modules, a private key is something that is actually owned by the person alone, and it is expected that the private key will not be known even to the second person, right. So, Bob basically signs the message that he wants to send out by encrypting with his private key and creates what is called as a signed message. The signed message is nothing but the original message encrypted with the private key. So, if this is the message that Bob wants to send out, he basically takes his private key, encrypts it, and then sends it out to the recipient over the network channel in order to make the message finally reach the recipient. So, let us say that Alice receives this particular message with the digital signature, that is basically the signed message. Now, Alice basically verifies the M is signed by Bob by trying to apply the Bob's public key. So, as we had actually seen before, the basic essence of the public key cryptography is that if I apply private key on one side while at the time of encryption and I apply the public key on the other side at the time of decryption, I should be able to generate the original plain text message back successfully, right, and also vice versa. So, if I apply the public key first and I can actually apply the private key at the time of decryption on the other side, and then also I will be able to generate the original message back. So, for the purpose of digital signature, what Alice as a recipient will basically do here is that since she is actually having access to Bob's public key will be applied on the signed message, and then the original message will be extracted. Now, how is this really turning out to be a digital signature? For the properties of it being verifiable and non-forgeable that we saw in the previous slide, this is how it is. So, Alice basically verifies that Bob has signed M. Why has Bob signed M? Because of the fact that it was Bob's public key that has been used at the time of decrypting. It should have been actually Bob's private key that should have been actually applied on the message, right. Then that is how by the property of the public key cryptography, I would have been able to get back the original message, right. Now, because of that fact, since the private key is going to be available only with Bob, and I have been able to generate the original message back by applying the public key of Bob, it has basically been proved that it has been Bob who has actually signed the original message, because it is expected that the private key of Bob is with nobody else other than Bob, right. So, with that fact, Alice basically verifies that Bob has actually signed the message. Now, no one else could have signed this particular message, because again it is expected that the private key of Bob is with nobody else other than that of Bob, and because of the fact that I have generated the message at the time of decryption by applying Bob's public key, the original message, the signed message should have been encrypted only with that of the Bob's private key, right. So, this sort of indirectly proves that nobody else other than Bob would have actually signed the original message, right. And then third fact is that Bob has actually signed the message and not some other M dash, right, so not some other message, because again if he has basically signed something else and for some reason that particular signed message had got modified, when I had actually applied Bob's public key at the time of decryption, I wouldn't have actually got back the original message, right. So, with these three facts, it is basically proven that it was indeed Bob who had actually signed the message and then sent it out to the Alice, in this case who is acting as the recipient. Now, the next part of this is non-repudiation, right. Now, what we mean by non-repudiation is that a person who has actually sent a message today cannot claim tomorrow that this particular message was not sent by him at all, right. So, now again, how is this digital signature going to help us in establishing this non-repudiation? Because Alice can basically take the message and the signature that Bob had actually sent Alice to court, and then prove that Bob has actually signed M, because since for the purpose of decryption here only the public key of Bob is required, even the court of law would actually have access to the public key of Bob, and when the court actually applies the public key of Bob on this signature and on the signed message, the original message which Bob would have actually sent would be getting regenerated, and thereby Bob cannot sort of deny tomorrow that this particular message was not sent by him, right. So, now coming into the message digest, what exactly is a message digest? So, if I really want to generate a digital fingerprint to such an extent that I want to sort of verify the data integrity part of it, right. Now, what we mean by data integrity is that if the sender has actually sent a set of messages, the receiver should basically receive the same message content and not a modified text, right. So, this is basically what is referred to as a data integrity. Now, what exactly is the goal behind creating something called as a message digest? So, the goal is basically to get a fixed length, easy to compute digital fingerprint, right. So, fixed length message digest, easy to compute digital fingerprint, which we will typically make use of by generating what is called as a hash function, right. So, when I apply a hash function to my message, I get as the output of that hash function a fixed size message digest, which we refer to as H of M, right. So, the original message is applied to the hash function and I get out something called as an hash value out of it, right. Now, what should be the basic properties of the hash function? The basic properties of the hash function is that it should basically produce me a fixed size message digest that I am going to call it as a fingerprint, and this particular message digest is going to be sent along with the message to the recipient, right. So, now what is expected is that the recipient will know the same hash function and how this hash function is operating also, and because the hash function is going to be operating on the message after it has been received on the receiver side, if there has been no modification in the message content between the source and the destination, I should be able to get back the same fixed size message digest on the receiver side also, right. Now, if I get back the same fixed size message digest on the receiver that we are calling as fingerprint here, then that essentially means that as part of my transfer there has been no modification, whether intentionally or unintentionally, of the entire text message, right. But on the other hand, if there has been a modification, right, my message digest is going to be getting modified, because of which I will be able to verify that there has been some corruption in transit after it has actually been transmitted out from the sender, right. So, based on that, in a lot of situations I could basically take a call on what I want to do with that type of a data once I detect that there has been a corruption or an inadvertent modification of the data in transit, right. So, the second property of the hash function should be that given a message digest X, computationally it should be infeasible to find a m such that X is equal to h of m. So, I do not want the original message to be regenerated out by having a look at what is my message digest value, right. So, if that is the scenario, it becomes difficult for me to use it from the network security point of view. So, thereby this particular property is also mandated for any hash function that is used, wherein that if a particular person who is actually trying to look at the transit data gets access to the message digest, looking at the message digest value, it should be computationally infeasible to generate back the message for which this particular message digest has actually been calculated, right. So, these are the typical properties of the hash function that would be required to have for implementing the purpose of the data integrity part of it from the network security point of view. So, some very common hash function algorithms, you have an MD5 hash function which is actually having a standard document RFC 1321. So, it computes a 128-bit message digest in a typical 4-step process, and MD5 is an algorithm that is not that much strong today, because of which you have another algorithm called as an SHA-1. So, SHA basically stands for secure hash algorithm. So, you have SHA-1, you have SHA-256, SHA-512 and so on, which are much more stronger than the first MD5 hash function algorithm that came out for generating these message digests. So, coming down to the fact of a digital certificate. Now, why is a digital certificate required is that we have always been telling that the public key is something that needs to be shared, for example, between the two parties. So, how could the public key be effectively shared would be something like wherein I would typically make use of a digital certificate, right. So, a typical digital certificate that will be exchanged between the client and the server, right. Before the data transfer starts in an encrypted form, the digital certificate would be of this particular format type. So, this will typically have a unique serial number. So, you see a unique serial number here, and it also will have details about who is the certificate owner. So, including what algorithm has actually been used and what key value has been used, but of course, the key value will not be explicitly displayed out, right. So, there will also be the validity part of the digital certificate which will be also available, and whenever this digital certificate is actually tried to be used after the validity has expired, right, that is when we will typically find out. So, for example, sometimes we actually get a warning message when we try to go to some website, right. So, it says that this particular digital certificate that the server is actually giving to the browser right now is something that has got invalid, maybe for any reason, right. So, it could be because the certificate itself has been revoked, or the certificate could have become invalid because the validity period has expired, or whatever it is, right. So, at that time the browser will basically throw up a pop-up message to the user saying that there is a problem with this particular certificate that has been given by the server, and whether the user would still like to continue with it by adding it as an exception, right. So, if the user is very clear that he wants to take that risk, he can say that I want to add it as an exception and then continue with the session. But on the other hand, if the user thinks that it is a security problem, it is a security issue possibly for him, he can basically block it up as well and then say that he does not want to continue with the session, right. So, because of that particular reason, the validity of the digital certificate that is used for exchanging the keys is also basically part of the digital certificate itself. Thank you.